In September 2015, Elizabeth Holmes graced the cover of Forbes magazine's Forbes 400 special issue, ranking the 400 richest people in the United States. She was listed at number 121 with a net worth of $4.5 billion at just 30 years old. Less than 1 year later, in July 2016, Forbes would revise Elizabeth Holmes' net worth from $4.5 billion down to zero. Holmes was the founder and CEO of the blood testing startup Theranos, a company she had started in 2003 at just 19 years old after dropping out of Stanford University after just 3 semesters of a chemical engineering program. At its peak in 2013, Theranos was valued at $10 billion and was worth more than Uber and Spotify. Holmes sold investors and the public on a vision of a compact blood analyzer that could perform over 200 tests on just a few drops of blood collected from a fingertip prick. The blood sample would be 100 to 1,000 times smaller than the large vials of blood used in traditional testing, and would be analyzed on a small desktop-sized device rather than the huge hulking machines used by most blood testing companies. The invention had the potential to disrupt the $72 billion blood testing industry by providing faster and cheaper tests requiring far less blood. This could encourage patients to be tested sooner and more frequently, detecting diseases earlier and saving lives. It could potentially have meant billions of dollars of savings for Medicare, Medicaid, and for pharmaceutical companies who spent millions each year on blood tests for their clinical trials. Holmes envisioned a device that could be deployed in the battlefield in war-torn areas or used in developing countries testing for Ebola or Zika. An at-home countertop device was also appealing at a time when all sorts of gadgets and tracking apps allowed consumers to be more in touch with their health data. Holmes envisioned a Theranos device in every home and began calling it the iPod of healthcare. Theranos was able to raise over $700 million from famous investors such as Rupert Murdoch, the Walton family, founders of Walmart, and the DeVos family. Holmes signed multi-million-dollar deals to open hundreds of Theranos wellness centers in Safeway and Walgreens stores. By 2013, Theranos had opened over 40 wellness centers in Walgreens stores across California, Arizona, and Pennsylvania. Holmes was named one of Time magazine's 100 most influential people and appeared on the covers of Forbes, Fortune, Inc. magazine, and the New York Times Style magazine. Then in 2015, it all came crashing down when an explosive Wall Street Journal article claimed that Theranos was not what it seemed. Overnight, Holmes went from being lauded as Silicon Valley's first female billionaire founder to one of its greatest ever frauds. What exactly was Theranos' scam? Well, when Holmes signed lucrative deals to open wellness centers in Walgreens and Safeway, Theranos' device couldn't yet do all the tests Holmes was claiming it could. They expected that by the time the wellness centers opened, they would have figured out how to do these tests. But the launch dates came and the devices still didn't work. Theranos kept delaying their launches until Holmes decided they couldn't afford to delay any longer. They were running out of time and money. At one point, it was estimated that they had only 2 months' worth of operating expenses left. And the Walgreens and Safeway deals were on the verge of falling apart if there were any more delays. Launching the wellness centers would allow Theranos to look like they had a working product, which would help them initiate a new round of fundraising. So Holmes decided to cheat. For most of their tests, instead of using their own proprietary device, Theranos was taking those tiny patient blood samples, diluting them to create more liquid, and running them in modified traditional blood testing machines. You know, those big hulking machines that they were supposed to be disrupting. There are 4 categories of lab tests. The only working model of the Theranos device, called the Edison, could only perform one of them. Most importantly, the Edison couldn't perform the most common type of lab test, the general chemistry array, which made up almost 2/3 of all doctor orders. Holmes accepted that they would have to do at least some tests the traditional way and just explain it away to the customers somehow. But they couldn't let the world know that they couldn't do the most common types of lab tests. Otherwise, everyone would know that their technology was limited. So they decided to collect finger prick samples for these tests anyway, then dilute them and run them on traditional machines. So Theranos engineers modified a traditional blood testing machine from one of their competitors so that it could work with finger prick samples. They fitted special cups inside the traditional machine so it could handle smaller quantities of liquid, and they also diluted the finger prick blood samples to create larger quantities. Theranos claimed that their device could do up to 200 types of blood tests, but it could really only do 12 tests. The majority of tests were being run on the competitors' devices. Diluting samples to create larger quantities meant that they were diluted beyond manufacturer specifications, which was problematic because it introduced wider margins of error. Theranos themselves saw that they were receiving unusual readings in many of their blood samples. Yet in spite of this, because they were running out of time and money, they decided to go live and begin accepting customers. Many healthcare providers immediately began to notice issues. One woman had blood tests that told her she was at risk of a stroke, only to head to the ER on Thanksgiving Eve to have a set of new tests done that showed she was just fine. She was saddled with a $3,000 bill. A pregnant woman was traumatized when a Theranos blood test falsely indicated that she was miscarrying. She continued to monitor her health anyway because it was recommended, but then later a blood test from another company showed her that she was still pregnant. One woman was incorrectly told she had tested positive for HIV antibodies, implying that she was HIV positive. Yet as complaints came into the Theranos offices, Theranos made excuses or in some cases simply ignored them. In 2015, a handful of former Theranos employees decided to go to authorities and to the press. A series of exposés not only showed that Theranos was using competitor machines, but they also exposed lies and exaggerations told by Holmes, such as false claims that her devices were being deployed on the battlefield in Afghanistan. By 2018, Theranos was shuttered, and Elizabeth Holmes and her number two, Sunny Balwani, who was also her former secret boyfriend, were charged with fraud. In early 2022, Elizabeth Holmes was found guilty of defrauding investors and is currently awaiting sentencing. Sunny Balwani is due to be tried separately later this year. How did Theranos get to this point where they were able to go live with a product they knew didn't work? How did their board allow this to happen? Where were the government regulators? Why didn't investors, Safeway, and Walgreens do their proper due diligence before sinking millions of dollars into Theranos? In this episode of Scandalcast, we will review 10 reasons why Theranos was able to pull off the scam for over a decade before finally getting caught. The reasons range from Elizabeth Holmes's Steve Jobs-like reality distortion field, to her ability to terrorize employees into silence, to her outright lying to investors with doctored documents and faked demonstrations. Reason number 1. The reputations of Holmes's board members and early investors made her appear legitimate. Many of Holmes's early investors came through personal connections. She received her first $1 million investment from Tim Draper, a veteran Silicon Valley venture capitalist who had early success with investing in Hotmail and later success investing in Uber and Tesla. Draper was Elizabeth's childhood neighbor and father of her close friend. Holmes was also introduced to investors by her college professor, Channing Robertson, a former dean of Stanford's engineering department whose lab she had worked in and who also eventually joined her board. Holmes was introduced to Don Lucas, a Silicon Valley scion and an early investor in Oracle, through a college friend of her father's. Don Lucas then brought in Oracle CEO Larry Ellison himself as an investor. Theranos was able to assemble an impressive board. In addition to Don Lucas, the board included George Shultz, former Secretary of State under Ronald Reagan, General James Mattis, Secretary of Defense under Donald Trump, former Senate Majority Leader Bill Frist, William Perry, former Secretary of Defense under Bill Clinton, and Henry Kissinger, Secretary of State and National Security Advisor under Nixon and Ford. Holmes had met many of these politicians through George Shultz, who was a fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford, and offered them places on her board in exchange for stock. Some investors claimed that the presence of so many political and military dignitaries on Theranos' board convinced them that Theranos had the military contracts Elizabeth falsely claimed they had. Number 2. Holmes had a Steve Jobs-like reality distortion field, which cast a spell over people, especially older men, who wouldn't hear a bad word about her. Perhaps one of the most noteworthy factors in the Theranos saga was how Holmes stacked her board with so many elder statesmen. Shultz and Kissinger were in their 90s. It was also notable that the board of Silicon Valley's first female billionaire founder contained no women at all. Theranos' board members often spoke of Elizabeth in effusive terms. Henry Kissinger said she had an ethereal quality, like a monk. General Mattis praised her integrity, saying that she had one of the most well-honed senses of personal and business ethics he had ever seen. Channing Robertson, her former Stanford professor, stated that he felt like he was looking into the eyes of the next Bill Gates or Steve Jobs. One former Theranos employee wondered if these older men simply felt enchanted at having a young, blonde, attractive, blue-eyed, up-and-coming female entrepreneur looking up to them for guidance. This doting attitude towards Elizabeth often meant that these men refused to hear a bad word about her. Avi Tevanian, a former Apple employee whom Holmes had convinced to join Theranos' board, grew worried about Elizabeth's constant excuses about why Theranos machines never seemed to work. She would also claim to have numerous deals in the works with pharmaceutical companies, but whenever he asked for details, she would say they were under legal review. Tevanian took his concerns to Don Lucas, the chairman of the board, a man who seemed to dote on Elizabeth like a granddaughter. He was stunned when Lucas simply asked him to resign. Elizabeth apparently didn't like how he asked too many questions. George Shultz was so taken with Elizabeth that he sided with her over his own grandson. Tyler Shultz had been introduced to Elizabeth Holmes by his grandfather and began working for Theranos straight out of college. He was disturbed by several things he saw at the company. For example, Tyler and his colleagues working in the lab found that the Theranos device accurately detected syphilis only 65 to 80% of the time, but the Theranos website reported a 95% score. When he approached Holmes with some of his concerns, he found the explanations tortured and unconvincing. Sunny Balwani responded to him by belittling his knowledge. Tyler eventually resigned from Theranos and tried to convince his grandfather that the company was misleading people, but George was unmoved. Even after Tyler left the company in frustration, George Shultz continued to invite Elizabeth Holmes to Shultz family events. Tyler Shultz later said in an interview that his grandfather loved Elizabeth almost like a family member. This spell Holmes seemed to cast over older males extended to those outside her board, such as Dr. J. Rosen, the man in charge of overseeing Walgreens' deal with Theranos. He was a health enthusiast who believed Theranos would change the industry and seemed taken with Elizabeth. Walgreens hired a lab consultant, Kevin Hunter, to evaluate their Theranos deal. Hunter had over a decade of experience in the field and had worked for one of the lab industry giants, Quest Corp. He immediately noticed several red flags. Holmes refused to let him see their lab and wouldn't agree to a simple test that compared 50 or so samples of blood between the Theranos machines and Stanford Hospital. But when Hunter took his concerns to J. Rosen, Rosen dismissed them. A similar situation occurred with Safeway. To many Safeway employees, their CEO, Steve Bird, seemed taken with Elizabeth and granted her an unusual amount of leeway. He made the effort to go see her at her office for meetings, a courtesy he didn't often grant others, and brought her gifts including an orchid and a model private jet. Safeway poured $100 million into renovating its stores to make space for Theranos wellness centers, but Elizabeth Holmes kept pushing back deadlines and Bird kept making excuses for her, which frustrated Safeway executives because they kept missing financial targets. In the meantime, Theranos began offering services at Safeway's employee clinics. The chief medical officer of the clinic immediately developed concerns. Theranos would ask for both pinpricks and traditional draws. They didn't put their machines in the clinic, but instead couriered the blood samples to a different lab. The results they sent back were often unusual, and retests elsewhere showed completely different results. But when the medical officer took his concerns to the CEO simply dismissed them. Eventually, Steve Bird resigned from his position as CEO. Many believed it was involuntary and that he was forced out partly because of the delays with the Theranos deal. Elderly males weren't the only ones who fell for Elizabeth Holmes's reality distortion field, however. Patrick O'Neill was the creative director of the LA branch of marketing firm Shy Today. Shy Today was the same marketing company used by Apple and had created Apple's legendary 1984 ad. Their association with Apple is likely why Holmes had hired them. She was known to be obsessed with Steve Jobs, wearing the same signature black turtleneck, driving her car without a license plate as Jobs had done, hiring the same marketing company he did, and even meeting with them on the same day of the week that Jobs did. Holmes had tried to convince the creator of the 1984 ad, Lee Clow, to come out of retirement and work for Theranos, but he politely declined. Shy Today created Theranos' website and advertising, designed their logo, and came up with their slogan, "One drop changes everything." The employees working directly on the ground with Theranos quickly grew suspicious of the company. They felt Holmes was making exaggerated claims about her device's capabilities and that she refused to provide any documentation backing them up. False advertising was punishable by law. One Shy Today employee grew so worried that he contacted a lawyer to make sure Shy Today would not be held legally responsible for any claims made in the advertising they created for Theranos if any of those claims turned out to be false. The night before Theranos' website was supposed to launch, Theranos' lawyers called an emergency meeting asking the Shy Today employees to remove or reword many of the claims on the website. For example, the claim that they performed all their lab tests on the fingerprick sample was changed to remove the words "all of." The lawyers also asked them to remove claims that Theranos tests possessed unrivaled accuracy. These last-minute changes convinced the Shy Today employees that their concerns about Theranos were justified. They went to Patrick O'Neill, the creative director, but he brushed them off. He believed Theranos would change the world and that Theranos would be his Apple, that the creative work he did for Theranos would be his legacy, the way Apple had been Lee Clow's legacy. O'Neill would eventually leave Shy Today and join Theranos as the chief creative director. Number 3. Some investors and corporate partners had FOMO. Kevin Hunter, the Walgreens consultant, found that Walgreens CFO was more willing to listen than the Theranos Walgreens partnership head, J. Rosen. The CFO carefully considered Hunter's words and was very worried at what he was hearing. Yet in spite of this, he decided to proceed anyway. He said they couldn't take the risk that the technology wound up being real and ended up in the hands of their chief rival, CVS. This was what was called FOMO in the industry, fear of missing out. Number 4. Holmes avoided investors with experience in healthcare and laboratory sciences. Theranos attracted many big-name investors: Rupert Murdoch, Betsy DeVos, Patriots owner Robert Kraft, Mexican billionaire Carlos Slim, among many others. But investment firms with strong healthcare backgrounds were noticeably absent. In 2003, when Holmes was just starting out, she did attempt to attract healthcare investors. MedVenture Associates, a VC firm that specialized in healthcare technology, met with Elizabeth but found that she struggled with technical questions. Holmes left the meeting with MedVenture seeming annoyed. 10 years later, in 2013, after going live with their Walgreens wellness centers, Theranos attracted the attention of some big-name VC firms with healthcare backgrounds. But John Carreyrou, the Wall Street Journal reporter who exposed Theranos, believed that by this point Elizabeth Holmes was deliberately avoiding these kinds of investors. Google Ventures, a Google-backed VC firm that had supported many successful healthcare startups like 23andMe, explored investing in Theranos but couldn't get a meeting. Holmes claimed that she simply wasn't interested in them. The fact that Theranos' board also consisted of no one with lab testing background was also noticeable. Only one board member, Bill Frist, had any healthcare background at all. He had trained as a surgeon, but he had left medicine for politics more than 3 decades earlier. Number 5. Holmes gave investors and corporate partners doctored documents and fake demos. Some investors did attempt to do some due diligence, but were simply duped. Theranos gave investors revenue numbers that were up to 10 times the company's own internal numbers. Most damningly, Holmes also sent potential investors and corporate partners doctored documents that were made to look like validation reports from large pharmaceutical companies Pfizer, GlaxoSmithKline, and Schering-Plough, when in fact Theranos had written the reports themselves. These were reports Theranos had written for these pharma companies, touting Theranos technology. But Elizabeth had doctored them, adding the pharmaceutical company logos to the documents and altering text, making it look like the pharma companies had written them. For example, for the Pfizer document, Holmes had carefully deleted a line that read, "Prepared for aid and power, Pfizer Inc., a line that may have given away that the document was prepared for Pfizer, not by Pfizer. In at least one email to Walgreens, Holmes had written, "Please find 3 independent due diligence reports on Theranos systems attached to this email." These reports come from GlaxoSmithKline, Pfizer, and Schering-Plough after their own technical validation and experience with Theranos systems in the field. The estate advisor for Henry Kissinger and the Walton family, and the investment advisor for the DeVos family, both claimed that they had believed these documents were prepared by the pharmaceutical companies and represented glowing endorsements of Theranos' technology. In an interview before the scandal, Henry Kissinger specifically mentioned that the Theranos device had undergone tests by Pfizer that confirmed its scientific validity. He seemed extremely impressed by this in particular. The jury in the Holmes trial said that these clearly doctored documents were one of the main reasons they found Elizabeth Holmes guilty of defrauding investors. Elizabeth also faked demonstrations. At her very first demonstration for a major pharmaceutical company, Novartis, in 2006, Holmes fed real blood into the Theranos device, but the results displayed on the screen were fake pre-recorded results because the device didn't actually work. Another strategy Theranos used was devised by Sunny Balwani, her then boyfriend / second in command. It was called the Null Protocol, which basically meant do nothing. Sunny had programmers design software that would make the device look like its progress bar had slowed down instead of showing an error message. That is, he would program the machines to do nothing. Theranos would reportedly have investors provide blood samples to the machines. The progress bars would slow down, making it look as though the machines were running slowly when in fact they weren't doing anything. The investors would eventually leave to attend their meetings, then lab technicians would come in, remove the blood samples from the machines, and then test them by hand on a lab bench. Investors would then receive results that they had no reason to believe were obtained dishonestly. Number 6. Holmes kept departments at Theranos siloed from each other so that only she and her number 2, Sunny Balwani, knew the big picture. At Theranos, different departments were often prevented from communicating with each other. Software was installed on computers that limited which departments could message each other. This was done under the guise of protecting the company's intellectual property, but it had another effect. Elizabeth and Sunny Balwani were the only ones with a complete picture of the current state of Theranos' technology. Senior executives would often be kept in the dark until they heard rumblings from subordinates. In 2006, after Elizabeth and a team of engineers returned from the Novartis presentation, the CFO discovered that the demonstration was faked only after he noticed an engineer looking glum after what he thought had been a successful demo and asked what was wrong. He was stunned to learn that he had been making revenue projections to investors based on a device that didn't actually work. Balwani and Holmes took steps to keep the fact that Theranos was using competitors' machines a secret known only to a few employees. They asked a particular engineer to modify the competitor's machine, a Siemens Advia, and ordered him to tell no one about the project. They also showered him with gifts to keep him loyal. They had other trusted staff change the names of these machines in Theranos' computer network to random names so that employees in other parts of the company couldn't tell what kind of machines they were. The fact that they were using competitors' machines was also kept secret from their board. Number 7. Holmes got rid of people who asked questions until Theranos was essentially filled with brown-nosers and people who were too afraid to speak up. Former Apple employee Avi Tevanian was just one of several individuals who were either asked to resign or simply be removed because they were asking tough questions. Kevin Hunter, the Walgreens consultant who had raised several red flags about Theranos, was asked to no longer attend Walgreens' weekly meetings with Theranos because he was upsetting Elizabeth. From very early on, Holmes demonstrated a willingness to fire employees at the drop of a hat. That CFO, who was surprised to learn that the Novartis demonstration had been faked, was fired after he insisted that Holmes immediately stop faking demos. Theranos' chief product designer, Anna Areola, who Holmes had poached from Apple, was asked to consider working elsewhere when she confronted Elizabeth with concerns that Theranos devices were being used in a cancer study by Pfizer when they weren't yet working reliably. The devices weren't actually being used to make medical decisions, but Areola didn't know this. Theranos' chief legal counsel and head of marketing went to the board with reports from subordinates that Elizabeth was misleading the board about the company's finances and the readiness of its technology. Don Lucas, the head of the board, had ignored Avi Tevanian, but he couldn't ignore it when two more high-level people came to him with similar complaints. The board decided to replace Elizabeth as CEO, but remarkably, she convinced them to change their minds. As they say, when you come at the king, or the queen in this case, you best not miss. Once she survived this coup attempt, Holmes turned around and immediately fired the two senior executives who had spoken out against her. Within 6 years, Theranos' entire senior staff had been replaced. It was at this point, around 2009, that Holmes would bring in her secret boyfriend, Sunny Balwani, as her number 2. Balwani mostly took over the firings after he joined, letting Holmes look like the good cop to his bad cop, though emails revealed during her criminal trial would later show that behind the scenes, Sunny would actually initially often write relatively tame first drafts of his emails to employees, and it was Elizabeth that would encourage him to use stronger language. Employees were fired, belittled, or excoriated for expressing the slightest doubts about Theranos' operations. One lab technician who wrote a memo citing that proper procedures weren't being followed in the lab was rewarded by being fired. Recall that Tyler Schultz had been blasted by Balwani after asking questions, with Sunny belittling his knowledge of statistics and laboratory procedures in a blistering email. It was right after this email that Tyler submitted his letter of resignation. When 2 employees chose to resign rather than go live with faulty blood tests, Sunny and Elizabeth held a meeting telling everyone who didn't have complete loyalty to Theranos to get the F out. A particularly tragic case of an employee who was cut down for raising concerns was that of a former Theranos chief scientist, Ian Gibbons, whose name was on many of Theranos' early patents. A brilliant scientist with several Cambridge degrees, he had once worked with Elizabeth Stanford professor Channing Robertson at another company, and was introduced to Elizabeth by Robertson. He reached out to Robertson in what he thought was a confidential conversation, telling him that the Theranos technology just wasn't working. Robertson told Elizabeth about it, and Elizabeth immediately fired Gibbons. Gibbons was later rehired after other employees spoke up for him, but he was placed in a less powerful position that reduced him to a desk job with no private office. He grew increasingly depressed, but he was in his late 60s and was afraid he wouldn't be able to find another job if he quit his Theranos job. When he was subpoenaed to testify in a patent dispute, he was afraid he'd get fired if he told the truth about Theranos technology, but was afraid to tell lies in a legal proceeding. Theranos kept pressuring him to find some sort of excuse to miss his hearing. Increasingly depressed, he took his own life by overdosing on pills. Holmes never even sent his wife any condolence messages. Eventually, the people who remained at the company were increasingly either yes men or people who were too afraid to speak up. Employees noticed that more and more scientists of Indian descent were being hired at the company and being put in increasingly senior positions. These South Asian employees were often seen as being overly submissive. They could see how people who spoke up were often fired. If they got fired, they would not only lose their jobs, but also their employment visas and be forced to leave the country. So they simply did as they were told. One anonymous Theranos employee wrote on Glassdoor.com that you only got ahead at Theranos by, quote, brown-nosing or having a brown nose, unquote. Number 8. Theranos intimidated past employees with powerful legal threats. Theranos retained the legal services of David Boies, one of the most renowned lawyers in the country. Boies had represented Al Gore during the 2000 election recount and had represented the United States government in its antitrust case against Microsoft. Theranos was paying him in $4.5 million of company stock. Employees who resigned from Theranos were asked to sign non-disclosure and non-disparagement forms in order to get their severance checks. Those who failed to comply with these NDAs faced the wrath of Theranos' formidable legal team. Theranos had sued former employees in the past, so employees knew that the threats were real. Former employees who became key whistleblowers endured enormous legal pressure. Adam Rosendorf, a former lab director who was once one of the highest paid employees at Theranos, had resigned after he could no longer stomach defending what he knew were flawed test results. He contacted a lawyer specializing in corporate whistleblowing and forwarded several damning emails to a personal Gmail account, emails that proved Sunny and Elizabeth knew that Theranos was cheating at some regulatory procedures. Theranos had carefully tracked employee computer activity and quickly detected that he had forwarded the emails to himself. They assailed him with enormous legal threats. His lawyer eventually advised him to just delete the emails because Theranos was simply too powerful to fight. Fortunately, he had forwarded some of the emails to his lawyer. Rosendorf would eventually become a key source for the Wall Street Journal expose. It was his high position at the company and the emails he had forwarded to his lawyer that made him an especially credible source that convinced the Wall Street Journal reporter to pursue the story in the first place. 2 other former employees would become whistleblowers. Tyler Schultz, George Schultz's grandson, and a friend of his called Erica Chung. They would both eventually contact regulators about Theranos and become sources for the Wall Street Journal reporter. Theranos responded by spending over $150,000 having them trailed by private investigators. Erica moved to a new address and was surprised to receive legal threats from David Boies' legal office at an address that even her own mother didn't know about yet. At one point, Tyler Schultz's lawyer's car was broken into and documents were stolen. One day, he was stunned when lawyers ambushed him at his grandparents' home and threatened him with lawsuits if he didn't sign certain documents and hand over the names of any other whistleblowers he knew. Tyler's parents would eventually spend over $400,000 in legal fees defending their son. Number 9. Holmes found ways to dodge regulators. When regulators performed their annual checkups on Theranos' labs, they were shown the lab containing traditional machines, while the lab containing Theranos' Edison devices were kept locked. Employees were instructed to go nowhere near the Edison labs when regulators were around. Theranos also cheated on regulatory tests. 3 times a year, regulators would send blood samples to major labs to see if they could correctly determine the concentrations of certain analytes in the sample. These tests, called proficiency tests, were supposed to test the lab's accuracy. But Theranos would run these proficiency tests on commercial machines instead of their own proprietary devices. Holmes also attempted to take advantage of regulatory loopholes to prevent her Edison machines from being evaluated by regulators. After meeting James Mattis in 2010, Holmes tried to arrange a deal with the military to deploy Edison machines in Afghanistan. A lieutenant colonel named David Shoemaker was sent to Palo Alto to make arrangements. Shoemaker had a PhD in microbiology and had once worked for the FDA. So he had the background to see through Holmes's blatant attempt to bypass regulations. Holmes claimed that the Edison devices didn't require FDA regulation because the real analysis was done when the results were beamed back to Theranos' central lab, and the central lab itself was already accredited. The Edisons were just dumb boxes that collected data and didn't need to be accredited themselves, she claimed. Shoemaker wasn't buying it. He asked Elizabeth to get written approval from the FDA confirming that her regulatory structure was allowed. Holmes agreed, but then never followed up. Shoemaker then contacted the FDA himself, and as he suspected, the FDA officials claimed that the regulatory structure was an attempt to bypass FDA regulation. This initiated a series of events that resulted in a surprise inspection of Theranos' lab. Luckily for Theranos, Holmes was tipped off about the investigation by Shoemaker's boss. She completely denied Shoemaker's claims, then contacted General Mattis, claiming that Shoemaker was spreading lies about the company. Intimidated by Mattis, Shoemaker quickly apologized. This was another example of an older male who was taken with Elizabeth, helping her essentially shut down someone who was raising real concerns about her. Theranos managed to altogether avoid having to submit their devices for regulatory approval by never actually placing them in the wellness centers. They had originally told investors that one of the advantages of their technology over traditional testing would be that their devices would be located right in the wellness centers at Walgreens or Safeway stores, and that patients would have test results in under 5 hours. But when the Walgreens wellness centers finally opened, blood samples were couriered all the way back to Theranos' Palo Alto lab. This not only allowed them to bypass regulation of their Edison devices, it also allowed them to carry out their ruse of doing most of their sample testing on traditional machines, not on their own device. Number 10. Elizabeth constantly dodged simple tests that would compare her devices to traditional methods. Elizabeth Holmes had an almost amusing habit of casually agreeing to comparison tests between her devices and traditional testing methods, and then just not following up. Splitting samples between a standard testing machine and Theranos' Edison devices and comparing the results would have been an easy, straightforward way to prove Theranos could do what they claimed. Unsurprisingly, people often requested these tests, and unsurprisingly, Elizabeth constantly found ways to dodge them. When the Walgreens consultant Kevin Hunter asked to compare 50 samples with tests done at Stanford Hospital, Holmes had simply refused, saying that she didn't trust the results from Stanford Hospital, a response which he unsurprisingly found odd. In many other circumstances, however, she would agree to comparison tests like they were no big deal, and then just never follow up. In the meeting with Shoemaker and General Mattis, it was eventually decided that rather than seek FDA approval, Theranos would conduct tests on anonymous blood samples that would also be analyzed via traditional methods for comparison. Holmes agreed and the matter seemed resolved. Then Theranos simply never followed up. By the time Mattis resigned 1 year later, Theranos still hadn't gotten back to the military. Her devices were never deployed by the military, even though she gave the impression to several investors and journalists that they had. Theranos had met with a 5-person team from Johns Hopkins University in 2010 and had provided the Hopkins scientists with proprietary data about their device. While the Hopkins scientists had called the technology novel and sound, they had not done any independent verification of their own. Bill Clark, the director of toxicology at Johns Hopkins and leader of that 5-person team, had asked Elizabeth Holmes to send him a Theranos device so that he could run tests comparing it to traditional methods himself. Holmes agreed as though it were no big deal, but then never followed up. Theranos nevertheless proceeded to tout the 2-page summary of their meeting with Hopkins scientists, which had called their technology novel and sound, as proof that their technology was backed up by scientists at the university. Even after the explosive Wall Street Journal article was released, Holmes continued to agree to, then dodge, simple comparison tests. Her board, who still mostly believed her at that point, asked her to run some simple comparison tests against 2 other competing labs and a university hospital in order to put the explosive Wall Street Journal allegations to rest. Once again, Holmes agreed like it was no big deal, and then never followed up, constantly providing excuses whenever she was asked about them. These are 10 ways in which Theranos was somehow able to last more than a decade and accumulate $700 million in investor capital before finally being exposed. Elizabeth Holmes probably didn't start out intending to be a fraud, but it is also evident that from the very early days in the company's history, Holmes showed a pattern of faking demos, dodging regulations, and firing or silencing anyone who spoke out against her questionable behavior. She built a board of older men who doted on her. She attracted investors with no laboratory experience who would be none the wiser to her shenanigans. It took the actions of a few brave whistleblowers to bring the company down. Theranos was trying to fake it till they made it. In a short upcoming bonus episode, we will speculate on whether Theranos could have succeeded in getting their technology to work if they had never gotten caught. Thanks for listening, and please like and subscribe if you enjoyed this episode and want to be notified of our upcoming episodes.